G'day everyone, it's my very great pleasure to be here today to talk to you on this subject of what happens in vagus, an exploration of the use of vagus nerve stimulation as a potential therapy for ME/CFS and beyond. Now you might be asking the question, does what happens in vagus stay in vagus? I think the real question is what part of the vagus are we talking about? And that's something that I'm going to be discussing in my presentation today. So the purpose of this presentation is for me to highlight how dysfunction in the autonomic nervous system may play a role in the symptoms of chronic diseases, including ME/CFS. I'll be exploring how this may be treatable to some degree with vagus nerve stimulation and other therapies that improve the functioning of the autonomic nervous system. And I'll also be reporting on outcome data from a project that I've run with people with ME/CFS who have personally chosen to experiment with this therapy. So in terms of the structure of my talk, I'll just chat briefly about what ME/CFS is. I won't labour that though, because I think you're all here because you know what it is, and talk about my journey with the illness as well. Then I want to look at two theories that I think are potentially relevant to the condition. Firstly, the cell danger response hypothesis, and then polyvagal theory. And I'll present a hypothesis regarding the possible effects of vagus nerve stimulation from a polyvagal theory perspective. I'll present some of the science of vagus nerve stimulation and also present the results from what I've called the Parasym data collection project. And then I'll discuss what the implications might be for research and therapy going forwards. So what is ME/CFS? I think you guys probably know what this is. Myalgic encephalomyelitis, also known as chronic fatigue syndrome. That's where we get the term ME/CFS. And I've just put some facts up there which I've gathered from the Open Medicine Foundation website, who are world leaders in funding collaborative research into ME/CFS. And my experience with the disease, my initial trigger was glandular fever, which I recovered quite well from. And then I had a gastric virus in 2009 and had 3 months off work with post-viral fatigue. And then it really hit in 2012 when I was under a lot of stress and I was over-exercising. I had a crash. And within a matter of a few days, I was severely unwell and I had 15 months off work. And I must say, I didn't really understand what chronic fatigue was or ME/CFS until I hit that big crash. I think it's a disease that's very difficult to understand unless you actually have it or you witness someone firsthand who has this. So the symptoms, I'm not going to read that out. I'm sure many of you would relate to this and have potentially been sicker than this yourself. Suffice to say that on my worst days I felt like I was dying, and I'm not exaggerating there. There's an interesting death-like quality to how it feels when you're just that sick. So if I was to sum this up, I would say that when you have ME/CFS, your body becomes a prison and an instrument of torture. And severe ME/CFS is like having multiple sclerosis, dementia, congestive heart failure, the flu and gastroenteritis all at once. It is an absolutely hideous condition, particularly when it's severe. So before I get into the science, I just want to put this big disclaimer out there. I'm not a doctor and I'm not a scientist, and I'm not qualified to advise you about the medical treatment of your own ME/CFS. And if you are considering changing anything in what you do for your own treatment after my presentation today, please speak to your doctor. Now, all of the reading and the research that I've done has been done independently. From my background as an OT, I haven't had support from an institution or a clinic, so as such, there may be some limitations to what I've done. I haven't benefited financially from any of this work. It's all been done on a voluntary basis. I'm going to be presenting some pretty complex models and information using very simple theories, and I'll do the best I can with that, but please refer back to the original science and theories for more information. And please note that theories are not facts and they require science to validate them. and I'll be not claiming any new treatments or cures for ME/CFS. As you may have noticed from the first slide, there isn't actually any approved treatment for this disease yet. Now I have to thank my husband for this cartoon. I've heard that ME/CFS being described as being like a ship that's weighed down by multiple anchors. So there's a lot going on, there's a lot that's not working right, and you have to pull up multiple anchors to actually get movement. One thing isn't going to do it, you've got to address a whole range of things. And what those anchors might be can be different for person to person. What I'll be talking about today, I think, could be a big anchor for some people, but we won't know until the research is done. So, I'm going to approach this from what I call a systems theory approach. So, many gains have been made in ME/CFS research by looking in at a micro level, so focusing on what's going on with genetics and the cell function and metabolism and dysfunction within organs, and there's fantastic research that's coming out. If you want to check it out, just look on the OMF website. It's absolutely amazing. The thing is that ME/CFS is a multi-systems disease. It kind of affects everything. So I think there might be some value in zooming out and trying to take more of a systems theory approach, and we might actually get some different understandings as to what the underlying mechanisms of the disease are. So there's two systems theories that I would like to address today. The first one is the cell danger response hypothesis by Robert Naviaux. And the second one, which is where I want to spend most of my time, is in something called Polyvagal Theory by Stephen Porges, which you may not have heard of. It doesn't generally get discussed in this kind of forum, but it is a theory that is referenced in Naviaux's work. So I'm just going to give you a real nutshell version of the cell danger response hypothesis. Naviaux proposes that when cells are exposed to threat, the cell danger response is triggered and many changes happen, including adenosine triphosphate levels go down, so that's ATP, which is chemical energy within all of our cells, and the autonomic nervous system goes into a threat state, which I'll discuss shortly. So ATP is produced by tiny structures in our cells called the mitochondria, and they act like little powerhouses that generate this ATP. And ATP is basically a carrier of energy. When the cell danger response is triggered, the mitochondria go from this powerhouse state into more of what Naviaux describes as a battleship state. So they actually start to coordinate cellular defence, and ATP levels go down and ATP starts leaking out of the cells. So what's the implications of low levels of ATP? Well, it's actually really, really significant. And just to explain this, I've brought along a little Lego model today. This is my ATP molecule. As I said, ATP is like a carrier of energy. This is produced in the mitochondria, adenosine triphosphate. So when this is used in a chemical reaction in your cells, bear in mind this is used for everything, in every cell. A phosphate is removed and that releases energy. This is now adenosine diphosphate, which goes back to the mitochondria, and a phosphate is reattached, making it ATP again. So it's this process of recycling and carrying energy around the cells, which basically enables us to be alive. The problem is when you don't have enough ATP, what happens is that your cells start to use adenosine diphosphate. The problem with this is that once you get to adenosine monophosphate, this is largely unusable and the whole thing gets excreted from your cells and you pee this out in the toilet. So you have to make a whole new cart from scratch, and that takes, according to Dr. Myhill, 1 to 4 days. So that's what I call a metabolic crash. And when we talk about staying in your energy envelope, that means using up ATP no faster than you can produce it. And for people who are severely unwell, there's hardly any of this knocking around. So this is a real problem. This is also the reason why graded exercise therapy, which proposes that you exceed your maximum capacity in order to try and build strength and stamina and recover, is so flawed because it's presuming that we've got normal levels of ATP. which is not supported by the research. So that's why if you are going to exercise, it needs to be within the energy envelope. And in fact, everything that you do needs to be within the energy envelope so that you're not losing these things out in the toilet. So this is a slide from Navio's 2017 talk on the cell danger response. So here you can see there's a range of different triggers which he's put in graphic form as being like mallets hitting the hammer, hitting the bell, which is a cell danger response. So, you know, as with ME/CFS, you know, it could be genetic factors, it could be physical trauma, psychological trauma, you know, it could be chemical exposure, bacteria, anything. So there's a diversity of triggers, but the response is the same, and it's the cell danger response. So it's this low energy state. And Navio proposes that this is what's going on in ME/CFS, but also many other chronic diseases. And at the point of him doing this presentation, these were the studies that he referred to. So we've got a whole range of chronic diseases, physical and psychiatric there. And he's, I guess, tried to express this as a Venn diagram, which is that daisy over there. So you've got different conditions, which are the petals, and then this unifying point of overlap, which he says is the cell danger response. So if I was to liken this theory to a metaphor, I'd say, you know, it's like a boat. I like that. I reckon that might float. And then comes along his paper this year, CDR 2019, and it is massive. This theory is epic. It's very complex. If it's true, it will transform how we understand medicine and chronic disease more broadly. The question is it going to float? And there needs to be a lot of research to actually find out whether this theory is going to work and is going to float. So we don't know if it's correct. However, there's two key points that I want to draw out of this theory. Firstly, this idea that there may be potential unifying points of overlap in chronic diseases, both physical and psychiatric. And I find his interest in autism and ME/CFS really interesting because I've noticed that a lot of the people that I know who have ME/CFS or fibro have a family history of autism, including me. So I don't know if that's significant, but I think it's really interesting. Also, the second point is the way that the autonomic nervous system may go into a threat mode when the CDR is triggered. So what is the autonomic nervous system and how does it respond in threat? Well, this is the brief version. The autonomic nervous system is essentially our automatic nervous system. It controls the functioning of our internal organs. And we've got two components. We've got the parasympathetic system, which is often called our rest and digest system. It acts like a brake. It slows everything down. And then we've got the sympathetic system, which is our fight and flight mechanism, and that ramps everything up for mobilisation. And as you can see here, this is the vagus nerve, which is the primary nerve of the autonomic nervous system. So vagus, nothing to do with that place in the United States. It's actually to do with the root, has the same root word as the term vagabond. So it's a wandering nerve. So if you can see over here, that yellow nerve, it's massive. That's your vagus nerve. And the orange one here is the facial nerve, which is very integrated with the functioning of the vagus nerve. And it contains pathways travelling to and from the brainstem, so sensory and motor. And the motor pathways regulate the functioning of internal organs like the heart and the gut and the lungs. And the sensory pathways detect signals of threat, such as from your gut and also immune signals. And it initiates something known as the sickness response in the brain, which is that feeling of malaise or just I don't feel well when you get a cold. That's the sickness response. It's that feeling of ugh, which I think we all know what that feels like because it's a big part of ME/CFS. Very interestingly, it also regulates inflammation via the inflammatory reflex. So are you getting a sense of how important this nerve is? It's really important. So as I said, we've got this traditional view of the ANS as being fight or flight or rest and digest. However, according to Polyvagal Theory by Stephen Porges, the ANS has 3 circuits, not 2. So poly meaning more than one. So we've got 2 vaguses. We've got a ventral vagus, which is present in mammals only, and then we've got a dorsal vagus, and they're both part of the parasympathetic nervous system, but they have different functions. So in situations of safety, our ventral vagus is dominating. That's our rest and digest, but it's also our tend and befriend. It's our social network. This is where spontaneous social behaviours like smiling activate in this green zone here. If we have a situation of danger, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and that's our fight and flight. Please note, this isn't a bad system. We actually use this to exercise. So a little bit of sympathetic activation is great, but if you have problems with anxiety, then you've got an overactive orange zone there. And then right to the end, we've got the dorsal vagus parasympathetic, which is our freeze and faint mode. So it actually immobilises you and you go into this frozen state. So what that actually looks like in nature is this. So we can see down here with the dorsal vagus immobilisation, what's the advantage of that in terms of survival? Well, if the predator gets complacent and thinks that the animal's dead because it looks dead, and it has a little rest because it's a bit tired from chasing this little zippy impala, if the nervous system of the impala detects a drop in the level of threat, then the sympathetic nervous system kicks in again and it'll be off. So it may actually help the animal to survive because it looks dead even though it's not. So how does this relate to us? Well, the balance of the autonomic nervous system circuits in a healthy state, I've represented graphically here. So we're representing really complex circuitry with one single line. Okay, and we've got dominance of the green zone and a little bit of the yellow for things like exercise. In a threat state, the orange zone is going to be functioning more, and potentially the red zone, depending on the level of threat. So what's the clinical implications of that? Well, if ME/CFS, people with ME/CFS have a low functioning green zone, we should see symptoms consistent with an overactive orange zone and potentially a red zone. So this is a chart of the autonomic nervous system by Babette Rothschild. I'd encourage you to Google it if you're interested in the detail, because unfortunately I don't have time to go through that. But this chart looks at the effect on the body and the brain of these different autonomic nervous system states. So we've got our green zone here, our orange, and then our red zone is this one down here. So this chart's actually been developed in relation to treatment of trauma. And Babette Rothschild has included some intermediate states in between those, pure 3 states. So we've got this blue zone here. So the blue and the green is where normal life should be, and the blue has a little bit of sympathetic activation for things like exercise. Orange to red is when there's threat. So in summary, ANS state affects everything. So if you just have a read of that and think about symptoms of ME/CFS. So this list has come from this chart, but also from training that I've done on polyvagal theory. The great news is that we can actually measure this. Isn't that amazing? So we can measure this using something called heart rate variability. So heart rate variability is different to just pure heart rate. It is the change in pace of the heart rate during the out-breath at rest. So this is measured at rest. And if there is a slower pace of the heart rate during the out-breath, that's an indication that the green zone is working well. If you don't get that change in heart rate, then you've got a poorly functioning green zone. So just to explain that a little better. So this shows heart rate here. Now in the middle here you can see that there's bigger gaps here compared with here. And the blue line is heart rate, which is getting slower during the out-breath because the green zone is functioning well. So the green zone acts as a brake specifically during the out-breath is when it acts. So this is how we know how well that green zone is working, which I just find fascinating that we can even measure that. So what I did when I found out about this, I thought, well, how does this all relate to Navio's idea that there's all these conditions that have this low functioning green zone? And I started doing a Google search, and this is what I came up with. Conditions where low heart rate variability may be present. And it's quite a list, and there's more as well. I think this is highly significant, and this is consistent with CDR theory. So I've borrowed Navio's DAISY, and it appears that ANS dysfunction, as measured by low heart rate variability, may be a unifying point in chronic disease. The question that I have, and that probably you have as well, so what? Is there also a unifying point of healing? Good news is that vagus nerve stimulation may activate the green zone. So I did a bit more Googling to look at what conditions have been treated using vagus nerve stimulation, and this is the list that I came up with. So the ones in yellow, there has been at least one study that's shown an improvement following vagus nerve stimulation, so an improvement in symptoms. Is just preliminary evidence. The degree of evidence varies. The ones in orange with 2 stars indicate where vagus nerve stimulation is an approved treatment in certain countries. Now, I'd never even heard of this treatment until this year. The ones in white, no research that I could find in ME/CFS. Schizophrenia, there was one study that didn't have a good outcome, but it's certainly being considered for further studies. And there's more. So this is the hypothesis that I want to present. Vagus nerve stimulation may reactivate a poorly functioning green zone, and the green zone may resume more normal function and downregulate or dampen down the other circuits. It's unclear how much change is possible due to underlying neuroplastic changes that might have happened in the circuits over time. So what happens in vagus might stay in vagus, but I'm not sure. This is just a hypothesis. Further questions that I have arising out of this are, if we're looking at this from a cell danger response point of view, we've got the ANS is in a threat state, and we've got the cells in a low energy state, and the system and the cells are constantly communicating. Can we communicate messages of safety by activating the green zone through the ANS, and is there potential for that to communicate safety to the cells and potentially change the amount of energy that's being produced within the cells? Don't know. These are questions that I have, and certainly questions that I've asked after using this therapy myself. So moving on to what is vagus nerve stimulation? So, vagus nerve stimulation began as an implanted device, much like a pacemaker, and it initially was used for treatment of epilepsy, and then it moved on to being used for treatment for depression, and it's sort of expanding from there because the benefits appear to be potentially quite broad. And transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation is applied on top of the skin at branches where the vagus nerve comes out, so that's at the ear and at the neck, and that's been around, I believe, since 2010. So in my Googling, these were the 3 devices that I managed to find. So the Parasym, which I believe is the only specific transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation device that you can get in Australia. Some people use TENS, and they get clips and use it for that purpose, but the clips aren't actually designed for vagus nerve stimulation, and I have some concerns about the comfort and the safety of that. So as such, I'll just be talking about the Parasym today, and this is for the treatment of depression, anxiety, insomnia and tinnitus. And there's no doctor's prescription required. You just need to do an online medical assessment with Parasym. Well, it is probably a good idea to chat with your GP. The other devices, so the NEMOS, which is for epilepsy, that's prescription only, and Gamma Core, once again, prescription only. Parasym costs $1,200. It is significantly cheaper than the other ones, so it might sound like a lot, but comparatively it's actually not too bad. In terms of how this device is applied, see this little thing here called the tragus? It just happens to sound like vagus, but it is a different thing. The vagus comes out of the tragus. That's one location for stimulation. The other one is the cymboconcha, which is what the NEMOS uses. That's actually the better location for stimulation because it's more densely innervated. So what I do is I moisten this area here for good conduction, click it onto there, and then you switch it on and gradually increase the intensity of the stimulation until you can just feel it. So it's just like a little tingle, it's not unpleasant, and then you reduce it until you can't feel it tingling anymore. The Parasym basically give you a setting that is specific for the condition that you have. So for ME/CFS, this is 20 hertz and 200 microseconds. And if you were to treat tinnitus, that would be 25 hertz and 250 microseconds. So it has slightly different effects on the brain. The dosage that they recommend is 1 hour a day, and for ME/CFS, it's split into 30 minutes in the morning and then in the afternoon as well. I've used it more than that. You can overdo it. You can get a sore tragus if you overdo it. They recommend an hour, but yes, some people do use it more. They will be coming out with a new model. I don't know when, but the clip design will be different because if you've got a small tragus, this thing just falls off. I'm okay, but I know some people have had issues with that. In terms of the safety of this as a therapy, it's really considered relatively low risk. So the most significant side effect is irritation at the site of stimulation, but that doesn't stop many people from using it. The Parasym isn't recommended for people with a pacemaker or a cochlear implant and some specific medical conditions, and it hasn't been tested yet on under 18s and pregnant women, so that's not recommended at this stage. It's deemed a non-significant risk device by the USA Food and Drug Administration, but interestingly, it's not available to the public yet in the US. It's only available in research contexts, so we're pretty lucky here, I think. In terms of what it might be doing, it may reduce inflammation. Remember me mentioning that inflammatory reflex? Reduce anxiety, improve mood and pain regulation. It may alter concentrations of neurotransmitters such as serotonin. There's preliminary evidence that it may reduce gut permeability, so leaky gut. It may promote neuroplasticity, so that's the brain's ability to make structural and functional changes, and that's what you want if you've had a brain injury, is you want neuroplastic healing. And as such, it may improve rehabilitation outcomes when VNS is paired with therapy, like in stroke rehab. So can you just see the application of this and the potential benefit of this? I just find this absolutely fascinating and very exciting. So it may improve functioning of the green zone, and if it does, it should affect everything. So I decided to test this hypothesis on myself and do some good data recording, just to get as clear a picture as I could about what was going on. So I decided to use the modified fatigue impact scale, and I also did a journal of my experience for 8 weeks. So this scale is divided into physical, cognitive and psychosocial subscales, and the green bar indicates the maximum score that you can get for each subscale, and the bit at the end is the total of all the subscales. So the orange bar is my score, which you can see has dropped across the board from the baseline to the 8-week mark. And my total score dropped from 40 out of 84 to 20 out of 84 in 8 weeks. So in calculating that improvement from my baseline, that's a 50% improvement in 8 weeks, which was, kind of mind-blowing. What did this feel like? This is the subjective experience of it. Many of the benefits I'll talk about happen during stimulation, so you can actually get a real-time effect, but then I've found this build-up effect over time as well. So improvement in my cognition and my thinking, reduction in brain fog, reduction in malaise, that's that feeling of just being really unwell. Improvement in sensory processing, so significantly improved vision, focus, depth perception, night vision. Auditory processing, so coping with noisy environments, shopping centres. Body position awareness and sense of balance. Neuromuscular benefits, feeling stronger, more coordinated, having more physical stamina, and I've used this while playing the piano and it's just incredible. Like just the focus that I can get and the agility and the strength that I've been able to regain that I haven't had for years. I feel like I'm connecting back with my instrument in a way that I haven't for a very long time, which is just a beautiful thing for me. My heart, I've noticed an increased heart rate range. So the upper limit of my heart rate has gone up, but I'm not getting post-exertional malaise. Gut function. I still have issues with IBS. However, if I'm bloated and I'm uncomfortable in my gut, I'll use this. And once I start stimulation, many times I'll literally hear my gut start moving instantaneously. It is that immediate. And it just relieves that discomfort in the gut. Psychological. Improved mood, decreased anxiety. Pain in my hands has gone. Activity engagement, able to do more with less rest and less episodes of post-exertional malaise. Social and emotional engagement, so increase in facial expressions. So friends have commented on that I'm kind of glowing now. I can actually feel my face more than I ever have. So like I've got some mild autistic traits and I've never been able to really feel my face very well. But now I'm very in touch with what's going on here, and I call it my rubber face because I can just feel it. And it's an amazing thing, it really is. And integration of the effects. So initially, I would describe it like, if you're in a darkened room and you're coming out into the bright sunshine and everything's just like, whoa, it's really bright. That's the kind of effect it had initially for me. Like my vision was like, whoa, I can see everything really clearly. This is freaking me out. And then it became integrated into my normal neurological functioning. So even though that sort of wow factor's gone now, the effects are still there, which is kind of good because you can't walk around in this state of amaze all the time. So in terms of side effects or no effects, I had an increased awareness of my organs initially, but that did fade after about a month. I had some weird bleeding episodes at about the 1 month mark. So nosebleeds, butt bleed, a big bruise on my abdomen. And I don't actually know what that means. I think it indicates that it's having some degree of significant effect on my body. I reduced my fish oil because that is a blood thinner, and I didn't know if the combination of really high fish oil and the stimulation was doing something to my blood, but I think that's fascinating. I don't know what it means, but I think it's really significant in some way. As I said, I did get some skin sensitivity if I was overstimulating, but just take a break from it and it would settle down. Insomnia, it's such a pain. The insomnia hasn't improved, but at least I'm being honest. Tinnitus, I haven't actually tried treating that yet because that involves using an audio file and doing that for 1 hour a day, and I just actually haven't had time. But I will do that at some point. So as you can see, it kind of fairly well blew my brain, but in a good way. And I was sharing my experience with friends, and they were sharing it with their friends. So in the end, there were 5 people who decided to purchase a Parasym device at their own cost and own risk. I recommended that they consult their GP as part of this, and that any medical oversight needed to be covered by their GP and Parasym, because I wasn't telling them that this was going to treat their ME. I was just saying, this is what's happened to me. If you use this, this is very experimental because there isn't any published research that I can find into this. So we don't know about safety and efficacy. The participants gave written consent for the data to be publicly presented here today. And I made it very clear that this is not a clinical trial, so we can't draw any conclusions from what I'll be presenting today. So I used 2 outcome measures, the Modified Fatigue Impact Scale. I found that this didn't give detailed enough information about people's experience. So a friend of mine alerted me to this questionnaire, the ANS Rewire questionnaire, which has been created by Daniel Neufer of ANS Rewire. And he very graciously gave me permission to use this scale. In doing so, it's not a personal endorsement from him, but I'm very grateful to him for that. And this questionnaire is divided into 2 subsections of symptoms and activity, so activity level. So here's the results. Each participant used the device for a different period of time, which is indicated there. So the baseline is the orange, the green is post-treatment, and any decrease is an improvement. So we can see that for 1, 3, and 5. So that's the Modified Fatigue Impact Scale. Then we move on to the symptom questionnaire. I've reversed the scoring on this just so that it's consistent with the Modified Fatigue Impact Scale. So a decrease is an improvement. Usually it's the other way around. And that one is the ANS Rewire Activity Questionnaire. Decrease is an improvement. So this is the summary of the data. So what I've done is a percentage, oh, you can't see that there. I'll tell you what those numbers are. So that's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25%. And I've calculated a percentage of improvement from the baseline score for each person, much as I did for myself. So as you can see, participant 1, 3 and 5 had some noticeable improvements. Participants 2 and 4 didn't do so well, and some of the bars aren't even present because they either got no change or they got worse. So that's the diagnoses of the participants. And the noticeable improvements pulled from all the participants included reduction in fatigue, so mostly cognitive, bit of physical, reduction in the severity of post-exertional malaise, pain, headaches, sore lymph nodes and throat, dizziness on standing, heart palpitations, reduction in sensory sensitivities to light, sound, taste, smell, touch, chemicals and temperature, and reduction in incontinence. Improved bowel motions, mood, feeling less irritable and more calm and able to participate in more activities, and an increase in facial expressions. So for the 2 participants where there wasn't really any noticeable improvement, both of them had a lot on their plate. Participant 2 had a very heavy workload, did report feeling a little bit demotivated or sleepy after stimulation, but is very keen to trial this device for longer. Participant 4 had some really noticeable improvements initially and then increased her workload or activity level, and then she crashed. So she went backwards. But she's going to be reducing her commitment shortly, and I hope that she will experience that improvement again. So these poor outcomes could be related in part to exceeding the energy envelope, but we don't know. I mean, there could be other factors, there are other anchors, we just really don't know. Adverse effects. So 1 person had a nosebleed in the first week. 3 participants accidentally used the device on the wrong setting. The factory setting wasn't the therapeutic setting. That has been changed now. So they were zapping themselves on the wrong setting and feeling quite unwell. So once that became evident, I let everyone know about that, and we had no more issues, and I notified Parasym, and they're now sending the devices out locked to the therapeutic setting for the person. That setting can be changed, but it just means that it's safe to start with, which is really good news. So, what are the implications for research and therapy? Firstly, I'd just like to talk about what's helped me. And I'll preface this by saying that I know we've all got probably different anchors, And some of the strategies that I have used won't be suitable for you guys because you might have multiple chemical sensitivities, and that eliminates so many options. None of these strategies are technically treatments, they're just what's worked for me. And I've decided to categorise them into these 3 categories, which is a very simplistic way of doing it, but I'm just trying to show how this relates to the models that I've been discussing. So we've got the ANS threat state, so what helps with that, what might help address or manage that low energy state, and then anything else that didn't fit into those categories I've put in other. So, strategies that may improve heart rate variability, the green zone. There's an interesting paper I've included in my references by Ewan and Sander that discusses natural ways of stimulating the vagus, and on that basis, this is how I've managed to work out that these strategies actually do that. So fish oil, I had no idea. But yes, it can improve heart rate variability. It does a lot of other things as well. But that's what started my recovery. So healthy diet and probiotics, gut health is so important. You know, we talk about, you know, this gut-brain connection and how gut health can influence the brain, and that's a very true thing. I went on a probiotic called Bioceuticals Ultrabiotic 45, and then noticed once I started doing all this research that Lactobacillus rhamnosus has been shown to improve the green zone. So I didn't know that at the time, but I had a massive improvement when I went on this in my mood and in my cognitive function. I describe it as feeling like I upgraded my brain to a Ferrari. It was just so overwhelming initially, and just my energy levels as well. Interestingly, I went on that when I was really severely ill and it didn't do a thing, but I think there was just too many other anchors that needed to be pulled up to actually get an effect. Very expensive. I use one every second day, and there may be other brands, I don't know. Stress management. Now, I'm not saying you can think your way out of this disease. Please don't misunderstand me. But ANS regulation and emotional regulation go hand in hand, and we need to learn how to manage our stress as best as we can. And slow breathing, particularly with a long out breath. Remember what I said before, the green zone is activated during the out breath. So if we can do slow breathing exercises, you may want to count in for 4, hold, and then count out for 6, and then hold. Slow breathing helps to activate the green zone, and I've found the use of meditation with the Smiling Mind app incredibly beneficial for me. I do that every time I come home from work. It's a bit like plugging your phone in for a charge. I just feel refreshed afterwards. Occasionally it doesn't help, but mostly it does, and I just feel so much better for it. Psychology's been helpful. CBT, acceptance commitment therapy. I was actually going through a phase after I'd returned to work whenever I'd get stressed out, my hair would fall out. And I got so sick of my hair falling out, I thought I really need to learn how to cope with stress better. And so I went and saw a psychologist and I learnt how to meditate, and lo and behold, the hair stops falling out. So it does have a real effect on the body. And social support. Social support activates the green zone. Laughter. All these things that just make us feel safe and happy and calm. And exercise. You cannot exercise your way out of this condition. It may not be safe for many people, and I was certainly not able to exercise for a long time. However, if it's safe and if it's done within the energy envelope, it may help with regulation of the autonomic nervous system and improve functioning of the green zone. And that's not just aerobic, that's things like stretching and more meditative exercises like Tai Chi or yoga, stuff like that. So there are a range of options. And of course, vagus nerve stimulation. Just want to make one comment before I move on. In relation to trying to work on gut health, a lot of people focus on that. But if the highway between your gut and your brain, which is your vagus, isn't functioning properly, there's a limit to how much improvement you might get. And I think that's why using this therapy on top of everything else has given me so much improvement, because it's actually getting that system functioning again. I don't think it's ever functioned very well, to be honest. So strategies that may improve or manage low energy state. I'm on a lot of supplements, and that was really significant for me in my recovery. Pacing, absolutely essential. Like we're talking about, you've got to manage this. You can't be letting your carts disappear. You've got to keep them running. Other strategies, vitamin D3. A clinician advised me to go on to drops that are absorbed through the tongue instead of just taking tablets, and I had a significant improvement when I changed that mode of absorption, because it apparently absorbs better through the mouth. So there's sprays and there's drops. Cognitive rehab. Now this is like exercise. If you've got spare mental energy, this is an option. If you don't, please don't do this. I used a Brain HQ website, which has been designed by neuroscientists, and that was really helpful in rehabbing myself so I could go back to work. And just symptom management, so sleeping meds and sertraline also for anxiety and low mood. So in using this approach, what have been the results? Well, I've been able to improve from severe ME/CFS to mild to moderate ME/CFS and a whole lot of other things. I used to be a severe migraine sufferer. I used to get, on average, 6 bad ones, so like moderate to severe, per month. That was my life for many, many years. Once I started treating my ME/CFS, it's barely a problem now. I get like 1 or maybe none, and just the odd mild headache, but it's incredible. This has done more for my migraines than any medication I've ever used. Anxiety and low mood definitely has worked on that. And yes, my mild autistic traits. I don't think I ever knew what the green zone was until I started treating my ME/CFS. My mental health is better than it's ever been. My sensory sensitivities have dampened down. My ability to engage with people, I think, has improved. It's just been an incredible experience for me. And this is all consistent with that hypothesis that chronic diseases may have some common underlying dysfunction that may be treatable with common therapies. So the implications for research and therapy for ME/CFS and beyond. I think we need to be taking a broader systems theory approach to things, not just for us, but also for other chronic diseases. I think we should be including assessment of autonomic functioning using heart rate variability, and consider treating that specifically and not just treating symptoms. And of course, we need research to determine what therapy is safe and effective, particularly for people who are severely ill, who are so fragile. Therapy should be passive for the severely ill, so it should use little or no energy, because they've got hardly anything there. They're down this end here. We shouldn't be asking them to exercise and do CBT. It's just crazy. And then it should move to active as capacity allows. It should be customised to the client and flexible to the changing needs. And we need to be addressing these multiple anchors. So in Dr. Bruce Walcott's presentation at the Emerge ME/CFS International Symposium, he discussed his targeted problem-solving approach. And that's about trying to find all those anchors and pull them up, as many as you can. But we also need a multidisciplinary approach, OT, physio, etc., to address those different specialised needs. So transcutaneous vagus nerve stimulation may be an ideal passive therapy for severely ill people. It does not use energy and it poses no chemical risk. It may treat some of the underlying causes of some of the symptoms of chronic disease and improve functional capacity. It may enhance the effectiveness of other therapies by promoting neuroplasticity. However, research is required to determine if the above is true for ME/CFS and for other chronic diseases. One thing, remember Curly from City Slickers? It's always going on about the one thing. You must keep inside your energy envelope, because you can invest in a Parasym, but if you keep pushing yourself, the gains that you might make can be lost because you're pushing yourself into a crash. And I'll admit, I've deteriorated in the last month or so because I've been putting this all together. It's been an enormous amount of work in my spare time. And I've had unexpected stressors that have cropped up, and then I got a cold. So no, I'm not doing as well as I was. I believe I can improve again, but I'm really going to have to pull those boundaries in again and do what I can to manage the things that have tipped it back in the wrong direction. And I have this thing called the 80% rule. This is my rule, you won't read it anywhere. But basically, if in any given day you've got 100%, that's your maximum amount of energy before you start, going into this crash, you should be aiming for 80%. You need a 20% buffer for rest and recovery and to account for unexpected stressors that might crop up. We've got to factor that in, and that's why pacing is just so critical. So if you remember nothing else, please remember that. Wouldn't it be great if we had one of these? It might be harder for doctors to write people off as psychosomatic if we had one of these. Well, measuring dysfunction and recovery. Wearable heart rate variability monitor. So by that I mean like a device that measures your heart rate and then syncs to a heart rate variability app. So I've got an example here. So this is using Elite HRV app and a chest strap. So a friend of mine who's an OT who's got severe ME, she's just started using this. And this is, now just bear in mind this red zone, yellow, this doesn't correlate with the zones I've just been talking about, so don't get confused with that. This bit here is the sympathetic and this blue here is the parasympathetic. So she's been telling me that when she uses meditation, she can shift things towards that parasympathetic zone, which is, evidence for what we feel. We feel better after doing this. It actually works. And, there's some evidence there that is actually doing that. I'm about to start experimenting with this myself. I can't say I know much about it, but it's my next project of something to investigate. People heard of the nanoneedle biosensor? So that's a device that's come out of research from the OMF, Open Medicine Foundation, and that is the first biologic measure of being able to distinguish who has ME/CFS and who doesn't. So in a cohort of people with ME/CFS and those that don't have it, they could use this test using blood and electricity to actually work out who had ME/CFS purely using this device, and it assesses cells' response to stress in the form of sodium chloride on the blood. I would love to see what the effect of vagus nerve stimulation, if anything, is having on the cells and how they respond to stress. I think that would be fascinating. Metabolic profiling, what's going on in the cells? Like I raised that question, is it changing the amount of energy that's available within the cells? Are there any other unifying points of dysfunction in chronic disease that we could be measuring? I watched a talk recently by Michael van Elzeke, who is very knowledgeable about the potential role of the vagus in ME. And he was saying that neuroinflammation is present across a range of chronic diseases, and you can measure that using something called microglial activation. So is that another DAISY? Is that another point of unity? And can we measure that? And is there a difference before and after with therapy? And of course, the patient's experience with outcome measures. So in conclusion, dysfunction in the autonomic nervous system may play a role in some symptoms of many chronic diseases, including ME/CFS, and I've discussed that from a polyvagal theory perspective. I've explored evidence and a hypothesis that vagus nerve stimulation may improve the symptoms of a range of chronic diseases by treating ANS dysfunction, and I've queried the possible effects on cellular energy production. I presented outcome measured data from people with ME/CFS who've chosen to personally experiment with this. There have been some improvements for some people, but we can't really draw any conclusions from this, and further research is required, or any research really. There isn't anything published. And I've also discussed the broader implications for research and to consider ANS-based therapies for chronic diseases, including ME/CFS. I'd just like to thank a few people who've supported me in this process, the participants in the Parasym data collection project, my husband, who, apart from doing that lovely little cartoon, has been just so supportive in listening to me and all my big ideas, and my family and my friends, the ME/CFS SA Society, Nathan Dundovic of Parasym, who's answered many, many questions and responded to feedback that we've given him, and Dr. Bruce Walcott, who's been a bit of a sounding board for me as well. So I want to just leave you with a sense of hope, because I feel very, very hopeful about where the research is and where the research is heading. I don't know whether anything from what I presented today is going to be useful. Time will tell. But I just want to speak directly to people who maybe have lost hope, who have hit their limit and they just can't see any way forward. I know that there's a lot of people that just don't want to be here anymore because the disease is just so hideous. And I was in that place myself and I couldn't see a way out. But I do just want to say, hang in there. You know, there is hope, and I do believe that progress is going to be made. And with that, I just want to end with something slightly poetic. This is some lyrics from a song by a band that writes very positive, empathic, hopeful music called King and Country, and it's a song called It's Not Over Yet. To everyone who's hit their limit, it's not over yet, it's not over yet. And even when you think you're finished, it's not over yet, it's not over yet. Keep on fighting, out of the dark, into the light, it's not over. Hope is rising, never give in, never give up. It's not over yet. Thank you.